All right, so this brings us to our last section for the day, which is my food story, Organoponicos, which is just my favorite example of community level food innovations. So this is something that took place in Cuba. Cuba, I have come to realize, is really, really underappreciated for their ingenuity in solving problems. And I don't specifically mean the Cuban government. You can have a lot of critique of what has happened at a federal level over the past 50 years. But when you look at the ways in which the people of Cuba solve problems that impact their communities, I think there's a lot of inspiration there. So what happened to Cuba during the Cold War? Well, Cuba relied heavily on the USSR to support its industries and its social needs. And so one example of this is that Cuba would export sugar to the USSR, and the USSR would provide petroleum products. So that meant gasoline for cars and fossil fuels for heating, for powering power plants and heating homes. But it also included what was used to create fertilizers and pesticides. So their agricultural system was based on this intensive farming using fossil fuel-based fertilizers and pesticides, primarily producing sugar, which was exported. And so most of their food, more than 50% of their food, was actually imported with partners that were backed by the USSR. And then the USSR collapsed. And so, boy, I think this happened in, let me see if the date's here, 1991. I remember this like it was yesterday. I was a sophomore in high school, and the USSR collapsed. And when that happened, the Cold War seemed to come to an end, and United States and other Western nations rejoiced, but Cuba lost a huge backer and a huge source of support. And the result was what's called Cuba's special period, where basically social and economic systems in Cuba almost collapsed. The Cuban economy contracted by more than 35%. They lost about 75% of their foreign trade. Domestic agricultural production fell by 50%. And if you looked at the individual diets of Cubans, their access to protein and their ability to eat protein plummeted by 40%. So they're facing starvation, economic collapse, and it was a disastrous period of time. And that gave rise to the Organoponicos. Now, initially in the 90s and early 2000s, this was all community-based agriculture. So it had very little federal support. What happened was little communities, individuals in those communities started to grow little farms in their households, in their yards, in the streets, on their balconies, and started to produce agriculture completely organically. Now, why? Were they like huge environmentalists and moving to address climate change? Absolutely not. They didn't have access to any of the fossil fuels that provided the resources to make industrial pesticides and fertilizers. So overnight, basically, they lost access to those industrial materials. And as a result, these communities had to shift their focus to producing food locally and informally using their backyards and the resources they had available. And so that meant composting everything so that they had rich soil. That meant growing locally. That meant establishing these informal trade networks and partnerships that where people were bartering and trading for produce. So one person, was primarily growing leafy greens, another person was primarily growing squash, and there was this informal system of trade that grew organically at the community level. And that happened in all of the big cities and then in some of the rural areas as well. In Havana, this provides, the Organoponicos are still in practice, but they're also subsidized by the federal government. So they adopted the policies that supported these organic farms in cities. Havana is probably the biggest and best example of this. It provides enough food and fruit and vegetables for all of the residents in Havana and employs more than 50,000 people in the city. Now that's key because if you stop industrial farming practices, you have to invest in manual labor. You have to pay people to go out and cultivate crops. You have to pay them to harvest crops. You have to pay them to process food. And the way that you maintain the workforce to do this is by paying them really, really well. And as a result of this support, it reduced the need to import food to only 16%. So instead of importing 50% of their food, they're only importing about 16%. And what's really interesting about this process is that people vie for these farming positions because they are high salaried positions and it provides access to the fresh produce that everybody wants. Now, sadly, as time has gone on and the Cuban government has sort of recovered from their economic downturn, they're starting to reestablish those intensive industrial practices using fertilizers and pesticides derived from fossil fuels. But the organoponicos are still an important source of food for several large cities and provides fresh fruits and vegetables and access to all those folks.